He smashed guitars, wrote rock operas, and defined an era. But when the amps go quiet, where does Pete Townshend call his home? Let's take a deeper look at the houses that held the chaos, creativity, and quiet corners of the Who's wildest mind. Before Pete Townshend was leaping through the air with a windmill-strummed guitar, before Tommy and Quadrophenia, and before the Who became one of the most explosive live acts in rock history, he was just a sharp, creative kid growing up in West London. Born in Chiswick in 1945, Pete's early years were spent in a modest post-war neighborhood, filled with rows of brick homes and the distant buzz of post-World War II recovery. It was here, in a flat in Shepherd's Bush, that Pete began his life with music, stitched into his surroundings. His home growing up was far from glamorous, but was packed with rhythm. His father, Cliff Townshend, was a professional saxophonist, and his mother, Betty, was a singer, so the house was always humming with jazz records, sheet music, and instruments scattered about. That creative energy soaked into Pete's DNA. Even before he picked up a guitar, the family's tiny living room served as his first concert hall, with brass instruments hanging from the wall and melodies floating from a record player in the corner. As a teenager, Pete was already obsessed with sound and space. He often retreated to his room, small, narrow, barely large enough for a bed and chair, where he'd plug in his guitar, sit cross-legged on the floor, and start experimenting. In those early rooms, he wasn't just practicing chords, he was starting to imagine what music could feel like. And it was in those same rooms that the idea of turning a rock album into a full narrative began taking shape. The very seeds of Tommy were planted, not in a studio, but in a cramped London bedroom above a family kitchen. When the Who started gaining attention in the mid-1960s, Pete stayed rooted in London. Even as the band's fame grew, he wasn't immediately drawn to excess. He rented a modest flat in Belgravia, which doubled as both his living space and creative writing cave. The space was filled with paper, journals, lyric drafts, stage concepts. The Who was chaotic on stage, but Pete's apartment was quiet and inward, giving him the sanctuary he needed to dive deep in songwriting. Later, Pete invested in a personal studio setup within his home, a small control room tucked inside a larger townhouse in Twickenham. This space was private, intimate, and crucial. It wasn't about flashy gear, it was about control. Here, Pete could shape sound exactly as he'd heard it in his head, without the distractions of a commercial studio or the demands of a label breathing down his neck. As the 70s rolled in and the Who exploded into superstardom, Pete Townshend found himself pulled in opposite directions. On one side, he was the face of a generation, writing rock operas, performing to thousands, and becoming a symbol of rebellion and art. On the other, he was quietly unraveling from the pressure, looking for calm in the chaos. The solution? He left behind the constant noise of London and settled into a riverside Georgian mansion in the sleepy village of Goring-on-Thames, Oxfordshire. It wasn't just a change of scenery, it was a lifeline. Goring is the kind of village where time slows down. Nestled along the Thames, it's dotted with stone cottages, green fields, and winding country lanes. Pete's home there wasn't some extravagant party house. It was elegant, historic, and surprisingly peaceful for someone so synonymous with destruction on stage. The Georgian mansion stood behind tall hedges and wrought iron gates, giving him the privacy he needed. But the real magic was inside. The house became Pete's creative sanctuary, the place where he could finally breathe. One of the first things Pete did after moving in was convert part of the property into a state-of-the-art recording studio. He named it Eel Pie, a nod to his earlier days running Eel Pie Studios in Twickenham. This version, though, was far more personal. The home studio became his hideaway, packed with reel-to-reel machines, vintage amps, and a rotating cast of guitars leaning against the walls like old friends. He didn't need a team of producers or engineers breathing down his neck. Here, in his own space, he could create on his terms. It was in his home that Pete wrote and recorded much of his solo material throughout the 80s and 90s. Albums like Empty Glass and White City were deeply personal, far removed from the stadium-sized bravado of The Who. You could hear the stillness of the countryside in the songs, the introspection, the distance, the attempts to wrestle demons without making noise about it. The home didn't just inspire him, it gave him room to confront himself. Outside, the garden stretched toward the river, offering him long walks and soft mornings. It was a far cry from his days in Shepherd's Bush or even his Belgravia flat. Here, the only sound was birdsong and the distant lapping of water. And for someone whose life had been defined by shattering amps and screaming fans, that silence was priceless. But Pete didn't retreat from the world entirely. The house also became a gathering place for friends and collaborators. Artists, writers, and musicians would stop by for extended stays, long dinners, and impromptu jam sessions. The vibe was intimate, but always inspired. Pete's partner, musician Rachel Fuller, often helped fill the house with music, energy, and warmth. The two of them turned it into more than just a residence. It was a living, breathing space for creative exploration. Even during his years of personal struggle, through addiction, self-doubt, and grief, Pete found refuge in that house. It wasn't always easy, but he's been open about his battles, and the house has seen its share of hard moments. But through it all, it remained a place of return, a place of reset. He once described the feeling of coming home from a tour, walking into the house, and just collapsing with gratitude that it still existed. That kind of connection to a space doesn't happen overnight. It grows over decades. The house also gave Pete something else he'd rarely had before: consistency. As The Who slowed down and his solo career took more shape, he was able to settle into a rhythm, working, writing, recording, resting. He even developed a morning routine that involved long walks along the river with his dogs, sometimes writing lyrics in his head before he even finished his coffee. That kind of grounded living was something he'd spent most of his life searching for. And in Goring-on-Thames, he finally found it. By the 2000s, the house had become not just a home, but part of Pete's legacy. It represented a different side of him: the reflective composer, the recovering addict, the loving partner, the literary mind who wrote music like novels. It was a far cry from the guitar-smashing mod of the 60s, and maybe that's the point. We all evolve. The wild kid from West London became a quiet river walker in Oxfordshire, still writing songs that mean something. In many ways, Pete's Georgian mansion mirrors his journey: stately, weathered, complex, and undeniably alive with creativity. It's a place where music and memory intertwine, where old pain finds new expression, and where peace doesn't mean silence, it just means space to think. By the 2000s, Pete Townshend had already lived more lives than most rock legends. He'd written some of the most iconic anthems in music history, helped invent the concept of the rock opera, and survived the whirlwind of fame, substance abuse, personal loss, and creative pressure. But as he enters his 60s and beyond, something remarkable happened. He didn't fade away. Instead, Pete began crafting one of the most thoughtful and grounded chapters of his life, much of it shaped inside the homes he now cherished more than ever. While his main residence remained his Georgian mansion in Goring-on-Thames, Pete also spent increasing time at his London flat in Richmond, a leafy riverside neighborhood just outside the city. Compared to the grandeur of his Oxfordshire home, the Richmond flat was much more subdued. Tucked into a classic Victorian building, it had large windows, cozy rooms, and views that overlooked the water. But the mood wasn't flashy. It was peaceful, intimate, and unassuming, much like Pete himself had become. This was the place where he could be a Londoner again, close to the pulse of the arts, but far from the spotlight. He'd take long walks along the Thames, browse antique bookstores, and pop into cafes without drawing attention. Here, he wrote quietly, not only music, but essays, memoirs, and reflections on aging, creativity, and what it means to have lived a life on fire and still find the breath to keep going. These later homes didn't just serve as retreats, they became spaces of healing. After years of chaos with The Who, both musically and personally, Pete had found a rhythm. His longtime partner, Rachel Fuller, a musician and composer in her own right, played a major role in this piece. Their home became a creative studio as much as a living space. They collaborated on music, streamed live sessions from their sitting room during the pandemic, and welcomed friends into a home that had shifted from being a fortress into something far more open and collaborative. It was during these years that Pete and Roger Daltrey decided to revive The Who, not as the wild, amp-destroying juggernaut of their youth, but as elder statesmen of rock, playing with a new level of emotional depth. When they toured, Pete would often retreat back to his quiet home life immediately after, grateful for the calm. He once said he could never live in LA or New York full-time because the noise never ends. What he wanted now was reflection, the kind you can only get in a home that feels like it's listening back. And the homes themselves were evolving too. Pete invested in restoring parts of his growing property, preserving its historical elements while updating the studio space with new equipment. He installed soundproofing and upgraded his mixing consoles, but kept the original wooden beams that made the place feel lived in. In interviews, he often mentioned how his house feels like an extension of his creativity. He doesn't need to go anywhere to make something powerful. He just walks into the next room. One of the more surprising shifts in recent years has been Pete's openness about mental health and emotional growth. He's used his writing room at home not only for lyrics and scripts, but for journaling and introspective work. He's talked about the importance of therapy, of healing from childhood trauma, and how domestic life gave him space to confront parts of himself he'd long avoided. It's no exaggeration to say that the house helped save the man. Not because it was grand or luxurious, but because it was stable. Even in his late 70s, Pete hasn't stopped creating. He's hinted at new solo work, continues to write prose, and remains an avid reader and thinker. His home office is reportedly lined with books on philosophy, history, and science, topics that once fueled the operatic ambition of albums like Quadrophenia and Lifehouse, but now inspire a quieter kind of artistry, the kind that isn't made for arenas, but for private reflection. At this point, Pete's homes represent more than addresses. They are metaphors for his life's evolution, from the narrow bedrooms of Shepherd's Bush, where he learned to play, to the chaotic flats of the Who's early years, to the riverfront piece of Goring in Richmond where he now writes, rests, and dreams. They are markers of the seasons of a life fully lived, and of a man who, after all the noise, finally figured out how to hear himself clearly. What are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.